In the early 1960s, a period marked by escalating scientific competition and deep suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union, the KGB's first chief directorate began receiving fragmented intelligence about a covert research program run by the CIA. The program was known only through whispers, references buried in intercepted diplomatic communications, unusual activity around certain U.S. military installations, and reports from Soviet scientists who had attended international conferences where American counterparts appeared unusually guarded about their research fields. These fragments suggested the existence of a classified laboratory associated with psychological experiments, biochemical studies, and emerging technologies that the Soviet Union could not afford to ignore. At the time, the CIA was conducting a wide range of clandestine research initiatives under programs that would later become public, such as M-Cultra. Much of the work was conducted in secured facilities tied to Fort Detrick and other specialized laboratories. Officially, these centers focused on biological defense and behavioral science, but the secrecy surrounding them fueled suspicion within Soviet intelligence. For the KGB, uncovering the true purpose of these laboratories was not simply a scientific concern, it was a matter of national security. If the CIA was experimenting with behavior modification, advanced toxins, or new covert technologies, the balance of power in the Cold War could shift in unpredictable ways. The breakthrough began not with a spy inside the facility, but with an anomaly discovered by KGB analysts in Moscow. A series of U.S. procurement orders, obtained through a combination of covert sources and intercepted shipping, manifests revealed unusual patterns. The orders included specialized laboratory glassware, isotopic compounds, and equipment designed for controlled environment experimentation. None of these items were exotic by themselves, but the combination suggested a project that did not match the public mission statements of the institutions. Receiving them, analysts began to construct a hypothesis. The CIA was funding a classified laboratory operating under the cover of a legitimate research program. Meanwhile, Soviet scientific delegations attending international symposiums noticed that certain American researchers avoided discussing their work entirely. A small group consistently declined interviews, skipped open sessions, and restricted their published findings. Soviet representatives reported these behaviors to the KGB, increasing suspicion that the United States was shielding a sensitive project. Each report was catalogued and cross-referenced with data from other sources, slowly revealing connections that had previously gone unnoticed. The intelligence picture sharpened when a former Eastern European scientist, recently emigrated to the United States, made indirect references during an intercepted phone call to government research that no one is allowed to mention. Although he did not describe the laboratory directly, his comments matched the pattern of secrecy the KGB was tracking. With this new information, the KGB expanded its focus, assigning additional officers to analyze scientific journals, patent filings, and U.S. government research contracts. Hidden among the open data were subtle clues: technology patents filed under shell companies, research funding routed through obscure agencies, and classified addendums attached to otherwise harmless studies. By the late 1960s, the KGB believed it had enough circumstantial evidence to assert that the CIA was operating a secret laboratory dedicated to experimental research with potential military or intelligence applications. What remained unclear was the location, funding structure, and true purpose of the facility. The KGB leadership understood that the only way to uncover those details was through human intelligence. They needed a source, someone inside the system or adjacent to it, who could confirm what the documents only implied. And as the Cold War intensified, opportunities to recruit such individuals slowly began to appear. By the early 1970s, the KGB's investigation into the suspected CIA laboratory had shifted from analytical reconstruction to active human intelligence gathering. The first chief directorate understood that documents, intercepted communications, and procurement data could only reveal the outline of a secret program. To uncover its inner workings, they needed a person with direct or indirect access, someone positioned close enough to the American scientific community to recognize unusual patterns, yet not tightly controlled by U.S. counterintelligence. Their first breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: a scientist from a Warsaw Pact nation who had recently returned from a research exchange program in the United States. The scientist, whose identity remained classified for decades, reported that several American colleagues worked under unusually restrictive confidentiality protocols. They avoided discussing their research even in private settings, declined invitations to social events, and hinted at involvement in projects they were not allowed to describe. He recalled small but telling details: restricted laboratory wings, rooms requiring multiple sign-ins, and sections of buildings illuminated late into the night long after official hours. Although none of this confirmed the existence of a CIA-controlled laboratory, the behavioral pattern aligned perfectly with earlier intelligence collected by the KGB. His testimony strengthened the hypothesis that a covert research facility might be operating under the cover of legitimate scientific institutions. Armed with this new information, the KGB expanded its recruitment efforts among foreign researchers working or studying in the United States. These individuals were often easier targets than American citizens, as many of them felt neglected or underappreciated by their host institutions. Some expressed ideological frustrations, while others simply sought financial support or protection. Through subtle approaches and long-term cultivation, the KGB eventually secured a small network of informants who provided scattered but valuable insights into laboratory practices, research grants, and personnel assignments within the U.S. scientific community. The most important development came when one of these informants mentioned an unusual administrative pattern. Several research grants in behavioral and biochemical sciences were being funneled through agencies and organizations not normally associated with classified work. The informant described grant officers who avoided detailed explanations, project supervisors who seemed to lack complete knowledge of the programs they oversaw, and laboratory staff who spoke vaguely about projects that came from somewhere else. The KGB interpreted this as a sign that the CIA might be using civilian institutions as front structures to support covert laboratory operations. To verify this, KGB analysts reconstructed the financial pathways of multiple U.S. research contracts by tracing allocations from the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, and smaller intermediary organizations. They discovered recurring connections to entities historically linked with CIA projects. Several of these intermediaries had previously been used to disguise funding for psychological research related to MKUltra. The pattern was not definitive, but compelling enough to suggest that at least one secret facility operated under the protective umbrella of legitimate scientific funding. Meanwhile, a second stream of intelligence emerged from the Soviet embassy in Washington. Diplomats reported that certain U.S. officials frequently visited Fort Detrick and related research centers under heavy security. Some of these officials had backgrounds, not in medicine or biology but in intelligence analysis and covert operations. Their presence suggested that research occurring inside these facilities extended beyond traditional scientific inquiry. For the KGB, this was further evidence that the CIA maintained a special laboratory focused on projects with potential military or psychological applications. The situation became even more intriguing when a Soviet operative embedded in a European technology firm gained access to documents referencing specialized biochemical compounds manufactured under confidential government contracts in the United States. The documents described materials used for controlled exposure experiments, behavioral modification studies, and testing of chemical agents with non-lethal incapacitating effects. Although the CIA was not explicitly named, the contracting structure matched those previously associated with covert operations. By combining intelligence from scientists, intercepted financial data, procurement analysis, and embassy observations, the KGB's internal report concluded that the CIA was likely running a laboratory dedicated to experimental research on human behavior, biological agents, or advanced interrogation methods. The report noted that such a facility would be kept entirely outside normal military channels and concealed through civilian partnerships to avoid detection. Still, one critical question remained unanswered. How much of this research was being actively applied in real-world intelligence operations? To answer that, the KGB would need more than scattered clues. They would need access to someone who had worked close enough to the program to describe its true purpose. And by the mid-1970s, such an opportunity unexpectedly began to take shape through the actions of a man who would later become one of the most valuable defectors of the Cold War. The turning point in the KGB's search for the secret CIA laboratory came in 1978, when a high-ranking officer from the Polish intelligence service, Colonel Ryszard Kukliński, defected to the West. His defection shocked the Warsaw Pact, and while he provided the CIA with vast information on Soviet military planning, his escape indirectly created a ripple effect within Eastern Bloc counterintelligence. In the aftermath, the KGB began quietly interrogating files, re-examining compromised networks, and reviewing the flow of sensitive scientific data throughout the alliance. This widespread internal audit unexpectedly revealed a different kind of vulnerability. Several scientists and technicians within Warsaw Pact institutions had once been approached by American officials connected with research programs that had no public record. The KGB did not obtain direct information from Kuklinski himself. He had defected to the United States, but the chaos following his escape exposed gaps in how classified scientific exchanges had been monitored. Analysts noticed that several American visitors to Eastern Bloc scientific conferences had backgrounds inconsistent with their declared academic specialties. Some claimed to work in behavioral science but published nothing. Others appeared underfunded on paper yet traveled extensively with U.S. government sponsorship. Their names had previously seemed unimportant, but after the defection crisis, KGB counterintelligence flagged them for deeper review. Around the same time, a far more valuable piece of intelligence surfaced from an unrelated direction. A source inside Western Europe, later identified only as a technical consultant with access to multinational research circles, reported that a U.S. contractor associated with military medical programs had recently expanded operations in complete secrecy. This expansion included the acquisition of land near a restricted facility where classified research was conducted. The consultant mentioned that several employees required special clearances unusual for biological defense work. The details were vague, but the pattern resembled earlier findings tied to McUltra and its successor programs. The KGB analyst began constructing a comprehensive map of American research entities connected through hidden funding channels. What emerged looked less like a single laboratory and more like a constellation of interconnected research units, all feeding into a central classified program. Some conducted biochemical studies, others specialized in psychological manipulation or interrogation resistance. The CIA had not created a standalone secret base. It had built a network, each node disguised within legitimate scientific institutions. This discovery drastically expanded the scope of what the KGB believed they were facing. But the most decisive breakthrough came from a source the KGB had cultivated for years, a mid-level scientist working indirectly for a defense contractor involved in experimental research. His access was limited, but he had enough familiarity with the internal structure of the program to confirm something groundbreaking. One of the laboratories receiving covert CIA funding was conducting controlled behavioral experiments involving sensory deprivation, psychoactive substances, and interrogation techniques. According to his account, the stated purpose was to evaluate human resilience under extreme conditions. But several project supervisors spoke openly about intelligence applications. The scientist had no proof of CIA involvement, but he repeatedly emphasized that many of the researchers were connected to agencies known for clandestine work. This information triggered immediate action within the KGB. For the first time, they felt confident that the laboratory they sought was not merely theoretical. It existed, was active, and contributed to a broader CIA effort to develop tools for interrogation, psychological influence, or resistance training. The KGB suspected the laboratory might even support covert field operations, including efforts to manipulate detainees, assess hypnosis under stress, or test incapacitating agents. Although these conclusions were partly speculative, they aligned closely with what would decades later be revealed in declassified CIA documents. To strengthen their case, the KGB began monitoring American scientific delegations more aggressively. They photographed conference participants, tracked their affiliations, and collected samples of research abstracts that had been withdrawn without explanation. More importantly, they observed that certain American attendees consistently avoided discussing specific topics, especially those related to human behavior under stress. This avoidance was striking because it occurred even in private conversations, suggesting the presence of classified restrictions. By the late 1970s, the KGB's internal assessment concluded that the CIA maintained a secret research laboratory operating under deep cover. Within the framework of U.S. scientific institutions, the exact location remained uncertain, but its existence was no longer in doubt. The KGB now believed the laboratory focused on technologies that could enhance interrogation methods, counteract Soviet psychological defenses, and support clandestine operations abroad. The next challenge was determining precisely where the laboratory was located and who had access to it. And as the search intensified, The KGB would soon encounter a new piece of intelligence that brought them closer than ever to uncovering the heart of the CIA's hidden research program. By the early 1980s, the KGB had accumulated enough fragmented intelligence to build a coherent picture of what the CIA was attempting to conceal. Still, one crucial element was missing, a direct link that identified the laboratory's location. The breakthrough came from a surprising direction: a technical procurement officer stationed at a Soviet trade mission in the United States. His job was to monitor scientific and industrial exports, a task that often placed him close to suppliers working with U.S. government research facilities. Over the years, he had learned to recognize unusual purchasing patterns, and one particular sequence caught his attention. A specialized supplier repeatedly filled orders for controlled environment equipment, sterile containment units, and custom-modified isolation chambers. These orders were routed through shell companies, but the delivery addresses were consistently near facilities associated with biological defense research. The procurement officer reported his observations to Moscow, and analysts immediately compared them with the intelligence collected from informants, conference monitoring, and financial tracing. The convergence was striking. One of the locations receiving specialized equipment was a restricted access research building whose official purpose did not justify the volume or type of materials ordered. Its funding pipeline matched earlier anomalies, identified through grant reconstruction. For the first time, the KGB believed they had identified the likely site of the CIA's secret laboratory. To validate the lead, the KGB activated a long-running operation involving an American academic who unknowingly provided information through seemingly harmless conversations with a Soviet cultural representative. The academic, a behavioral scientist with occasional ties to government-funded research, described a facility where unusual experiments were conducted under strict confidentiality. He noted that some of his colleagues had been invited to consult on classified defense-related studies, though they were given only partial information about the projects. They spoke of rooms with enhanced shielding, experiments involving extreme sensory conditions, and research supervisors who reported not to scientific institutions but to unnamed federal agencies. Although the academic had never been inside the restricted areas, his descriptions matched nearly every indicator the KGB had been piecing together for over a decade. The details were consistent with a laboratory designed for controlled experiments on human responses to stress, chemical stimuli, or psychological manipulation, fields that the CIA had pursued aggressively during the MKUltra era and had quietly continued under new program names after the scandal became public. Meanwhile, the KGB's signals intelligence units detected increased encrypted communication, traffic between the suspected facility and a nearby military installation. Although the content remained inaccessible, the timing and frequency of the transmission suggested coordination between intelligence, personnel, and scientific researchers. The KGB interpreted this as evidence that the laboratory served not merely as a scientific site but as part of an operational support structure for covert CIA activities abroad. The picture grew clearer when a Soviet operative in Western Europe obtained partial documentation related to a U.S. government contract for advanced interrogation resistance studies. While the documents were intentionally vague, they described the development of methods to influence memory, disrupt cognitive processing, and assess human vulnerability to psychological pressure. The terminology resembled earlier CIA programs, yet the contract appeared to be administered through civilian intermediaries, masking its connection to intelligence agencies. Analysts concluded that the research described in the contract was almost certainly tied to the same laboratory identified by the procurement intelligence. To confirm these findings, the KGB employed a method they used frequently during the Cold War: tracking visiting American delegations. Diplomats and scientific exchange groups traveling from the United States often revealed more through their movements than through their statements. A group of officials associated with behavioral science repeatedly visited the same region as the suspected laboratory. Their trips were brief, tightly scheduled, and conducted under an unusual level of security. None of the official itineraries listed the facility they were suspected of visiting. At this point, the KGB's confidence in their assessment was high. Their internal report concluded that the CIA laboratory was part of a broader effort aimed at enhancing interrogation techniques, developing psychological stress tools, and testing chemical agents with potential operational value. These findings did not surprise senior KGB officers. Soviet intelligence had long assumed that the United States maintained such programs. What made this discovery significant was the depth of detail the KGB had been able to gather, despite the CIA's tight operational security. By 1982, the first chief directorate circulated a classified memo describing the laboratory's structure, research objectives, and likely intelligence applications. The memo suggested that the CIA intended to develop methods capable of undermining Soviet resistance training, influencing detainee behavior, and supporting clandestine operations requiring psychological leverage. Although the memo stopped short of identifying all personnel involved, it marked the first time the KGB had conclusively mapped the secret facility's existence. What they did not yet know, and what would become clear only in the coming years, was how the laboratory's purpose extended far beyond traditional intelligence research. The final pieces of the puzzle would come from a source none of them expected, a former insider who would later reveal the true nature of the experiments that had remained hidden for decades. By the mid-1980s, the KGB had already pieced together the structural outline of the CIA's secret laboratory, but the final confirmation arrived from a source whose identity remained classified long after the Cold War ended. He was not a high-ranking defector or a deeply embedded spy. Rather, he was a former contractor who had participated in several controlled experiments tied to U.S. intelligence research. After leaving government work under stressful circumstances, he settled in Western Europe, where Soviet intelligence eventually identified him as a potential source. What began as a cautious contact gradually evolved into a detailed account of the laboratory's purpose, methodology, and oversight. According to his testimony, the laboratory's work extended far beyond what the KGB had initially suspected. The experiments were not limited to behavioral conditioning or biochemical analysis. They also explored the boundaries of human cognition under stress, the degradation of memory through controlled stimuli, and methods intended to assess a subject's ability to resist interrogation. The CIA viewed these studies not as offensive tools but as strategic assets in understanding how foreign agents, soldiers, or detainees might behave under extreme conditions. The source described multi-stage trials involving sensory deprivation, induced disorientation, and testing of non-lethal agents designed to impair judgment without causing permanent harm. What shocked the KGB analysts was the level of institutional protection surrounding the program. The source confirmed that researchers were required to sign layered confidentiality agreements, each tied to separate components of the project. Many knew only fragments of the overall objectives, with the most sensitive information limited to a small circle of intelligence liaisons. The laboratory operated as a compartmentalized system, ensuring that no single individual possessed enough knowledge to compromise the entire program. Funding flowed through civilian intermediaries. Oversight reports were disguised as routine medical reviews, and personnel were rotated, frequently to prevent familiarity from exposing operational patterns. The source also revealed that the CIA adjusted the laboratory's direction over time. After the public exposure of Mokultra, the agency shifted its approach, avoiding direct experimentation with substances that carried political or ethical risk. Instead, it focused on psychological variables, stress thresholds, and behavioral resilience. These new methods were more sophisticated, less traceable, and better aligned with modern interrogation doctrines. The laboratory's output contributed to classified training materials for field officers, advising them on how to exploit fatigue, confusion, or emotional pressure in controlled environments. Although the experiments were not designed for mass application, they provided insights that intelligence personnel considered strategically valuable. The KGB cross-checked the source's claims with their existing intelligence. Each detail, however small, aligned with earlier findings. Procurement patterns, unexplained visits by U.S. officials, and funding routes suddenly made sense in light of the insider's testimony. Analysts concluded that the laboratory functioned as a critical component of a broader intelligence infrastructure, one that combined scientific research with psychological doctrine. The laboratory was not a singular threat, but part of an evolving system that aimed to strengthen U.S. intelligence capabilities by understanding vulnerabilities in human behavior. With this confirmation, the KGB compiled a final, classified report summarizing more than 20 years of intelligence. The report identified key institutions involved in the program, outlined the network of cover organizations, and explained how the CIA concealed the laboratory's activities behind academic and medical fronts. It also detailed the potential risks to Soviet operatives, recommending updates to resistance training programs and advising increased monitoring of psychological research conducted in the West for Soviet leadership. The discovery underscored the necessity of maintaining vigilance in an era when scientific progress increasingly shaped intelligence strategy. Yet the most remarkable part of the story came years later, when portions of CIA behavioral research were declassified in the 1990s and early 2000s. Although much remained classified, enough was released to validate many aspects of the KGB's long investigation. Programs associated with interrogation resistance, psychological stress studies, and memory disruption had indeed existed, often maintained under strict compartmentalization. While the full details of the laboratory remained concealed, the declassified material confirmed that the KGB's reconstruction had been far more accurate than Western analysts once believed. Thus, the question of how the KGB discovered the secret CIA laboratory was not answered through a single event or a dramatic espionage operation. It was the result of decades of patient intelligence gathering, analyzing procurement records, cultivating scientific sources, intercepting communications, tracing funding networks, and finally securing testimony from a former insider. The discovery illustrated the depth of the intelligence war fought in silence, where laboratories and research programs became as crucial as spies and weapons. And even decades later, much of what both sides learned remains locked behind classified doors. A reminder that the scientific front of the Cold War was one of its most secretive battlefields.